A lock turned without a hand in sight. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Your words carry these mysteries further. Let's step inside. It was in the second week of November, during a spell of relentless rain that beat down upon the soot-darkened bricks of Baker Street, that our doorbell rang at precisely 9:30 in the morning. Holmes, who had spent the previous night elbow-deep in chemical experiments that left our sitting room thick with a noxious stench, did not stir from his chair. I, however, was glad for the interruption. I had taken to standing by the window in the hope that some distraction might relieve me of the headache caused by the fumes and Holmes's muttered monologues about phosphorus traces and atmospheric pressure variances. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card upon a small silver tray. "A Mr. Lionel Gedge, sir," she said, with the kind of clipped disdain she reserved for clients who arrived too early, too nervous, or too damp. "Send him in," Holmes called lazily from his chair. "And Watson, do pour the poor fellow some tea. You'll find the pot tolerably warm, assuming the laws of thermodynamics have not abandoned us overnight." The man who entered was young, perhaps not yet 30, though his haggard expression and dishevelled clothes lent him the weary look of a man well past his years. His collar was turned up against the rain, but his cravat was damp and crooked, and the knees of his trousers bore fresh mud stains. He removed his hat and clutched it in both hands, stepping forward hesitantly. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," he began, his voice uncertain but urgent. I was told you might be willing to hear me out, though I hardly know if this qualifies as a case, exactly." "That is a promising beginning," Holmes said, springing suddenly to his feet. "A man unsure if he even has a case is often the one standing unknowingly at the edge of the abyss. Sit, Mr. Gedge. Speak freely. Tea, Watson?" I handed the man a cup, which he accepted with trembling hands. "My name, as I said, is Lionel Gedge. I'm a solicitor's assistant at Pettigrew and Hartwell. Nothing impressive, but respectable work. I live alone, just south of the river, in a modest flat in Lambeth." He paused, clearly struggling to articulate himself. "2 nights ago," he continued at last, "I locked my flat before bed, as I always do. Bolted the door even. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no adjacent buildings close enough to allow for climbing, and yet when I woke the next morning, the front door was wide open." Holmes raised a single eyebrow. "Open, you say? As in unlatched?" "As in fully ajar," Gedge replied, swinging gently in the draught from the hall. "Was anything taken?" "Not a thing. My money, my papers, the silver watch on the mantel, all untouched. No sign of entry, no damage to the lock period, no footprints on the carpet, and nothing disturbed. And yet the door was open." Gedge nodded, his face pale. "I thought at first it must be a mistake," he said, "that I had dreamed locking it or somehow failed to do so. But last night I was meticulous. I tested the bolt, checked it thrice, and this morning, again, it was open." Holmes turned toward the fire and stood there for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A curious incident," he said at last. "An empty flat that unlocks itself in the night, yet no evidence of intrusion, no theft, no message left behind. The motives, if any, are shrouded." "I don't believe it's merely a prank, Mr. Holmes," Gedge said quickly. "Last night, just after midnight, I thought I heard something, a soft click, like the turn of a key. But when I rose from bed and went to the hallway, the door was still closed. It wasn't until morning that I found it open again." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Doctor, what do you make of it?" "I confess," I said, "the detail of the unforced lock is most perplexing. Had the door simply been left ajar once, it could be dismissed. But twice, with conscious precautions taken—" "Quite," Holmes interrupted. "Tell me, Mr. Gedge, who else possesses a key to your flat?" "No one. The landlord keeps a master, I suppose, but I trust him implicitly. He's a retired vicar." "Trust is not a currency accepted by burglars," Holmes said sharply. "Still, let us not leap ahead. Have you received any threats of late? Any quarrels? Unpleasant dealings in your professional life?" "None, sir. I'm hardly a man of interest to anyone, criminal or otherwise. My life is orderly, dull even." Good, Holmes said, clapping his hands once. An orderly life is an excellent baseline for detecting disturbances. He turned toward the window and watched the rain for a moment. Doctor, he said, fetch your coat. Mr. Gedge, we shall accompany you to Lambeth at once. I wish to see this door of yours and test its temperament for myself. Gedge looked visibly relieved. Oh, thank you, Mr. Holmes. I realize it may be nothing, but it's been disturbing me more than I can say. Holmes merely nodded, his gaze distant. Already, I could tell, his mind was several steps ahead of ours. As we stepped out into the rain, Holmes turned to me and said in a low voice, "A locked door that opens itself without force and without motive is a contradiction in terms. And contradictions, Watson, are the bread and butter of truth." The rain had not relented by the time our hansom cab pulled into a narrow street off Kennington Lane. Grey smoke curled from chimney pots above, and rivulets of water ran down the brick facades of tall, shabby buildings. Lambeth had always seemed to me a district suspended between respectability and squalor. Orderly homes standing uneasily beside crumbling tenements and lodging. Houses that reeked faintly of gin and regret. Mr. Lionel Gedge led us up 3 flights of well-worn wooden stairs, each creaking more mournfully than the last. The hallway was dim, lit only by a narrow window at the far end and a flickering gas sconce that cast uneasy shadows on the stained wallpaper. He stopped before a plain, unremarkable door painted dull green. "There," he said with a half-whisper, as if afraid to disturb the silence. "This is it." Holmes crouched immediately, his fingers running lightly over the brass keyhole and the edge of the lock casing. His eyes gleamed with the same keen intensity I had seen when he examined a trace of tobacco ash or the scuff on a boot heel. "You said there was no sign of forced entry?" Holmes asked, already knowing the answer. "None. And I examined it again this morning. No scratches, no bruising on the wood. The bolt functions perfectly." Holmes gave no reply, only withdrew a small magnifying lens from his coat and leaned in close. He moved with swift economy, his motions spare and exact, like those of a surgeon selecting his tools. "Watson, take a look here, along the outer rim of the keyhole." I knelt beside him. There, barely perceptible, was a thin smudge, not quite oily, not quite dusty. "What do you make of it?" he asked. "Smudge of dirt, perhaps," I offered. "Could be residue from a key." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, but not from Mr. Gedge's own key, I think. See the minute pattern in the mark? Vertical, almost granular. Something has been inserted here that left behind more than just moisture. A rougher edge than one would expect from a standard locksmith's cut." He stood and gave the door a subtle push. It swung inward without a sound. "The latch is finely oiled. Curious for a tenant who claims not to have tampered with it since taking up residence." Gedge looked startled. "But I haven't, I swear it, unless the landlord—" "Unless," Holmes echoed softly. "Tell me, has anyone else recently entered your rooms, even with your permission?" "Number not, since I moved in 4 months ago." Holmes stepped into the flat. It was sparse but clean, with an air of humble orderliness. A narrow sitting room led to a modest kitchen, and further still to a single bedroom whose door stood open. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn back to reveal only grey light and streaks of rain. "You did not by any chance leave this window unlatched?" Holmes asked, gesturing to the bedroom. "Never," said Gedge firmly. "In fact, I double-latch it each night. I dislike the draught." "Quite right. A man of consistent habits is a great asset to an investigation." Holmes moved deliberately from room to room, noting each detail with that peculiar gaze that seemed to absorb more than it revealed. He paused by the mantel in the sitting room, where a silver watch lay exactly where Gedge had said it would. Then he crossed to the small writing desk beneath the window and lifted the lid. "Do you write much by hand, Mr. Gedge?" "Only correspondence for work, and some personal notes. Why do you ask?" "There is something very specific about the scratches on your inkstand. See here, 3 diagonal grooves as though the quill were habitually placed back with a certain downward force, yet the inkwell itself is half full, and the nibs of your pen's quite clean. I haven't written in several days, Gedge admitted. Not since before the first incident. I've been too rattled. Yet someone has, Holmes murmured. He leaned closer to the desk, drew out the drawer and held it open. There, tucked near the back corner, was a tiny triangle of paper. He withdrew it with tweezers from his coat. Not torn, but sheared with some precision, he muttered. A page removed from a document of some kind. He turned it over. On one side were the ghostly remnants of penciled handwriting. Barely visible, but enough to stir something in Holmes. His lips drew tight. "What is it?" I asked. He said nothing, only slipped the fragment into an envelope and pocketed it. Then he crossed to the bedroom once more and knelt beside the wardrobe. From its shadowed corner he retrieved something unexpected, a crumpled scrap of cotton cloth, dirtied with soil and what looked suspiciously like brass polish. "Mr. Gedge," Holmes said slowly, "are you aware of any maintenance work recently carried out in this building? Plumbing, electrical, locksmithing?" "None that I know of. There's an elderly caretaker, Mr. Linley, but he doesn't do much more than sweep the stairs and carry the post." "And when was he last in your flat?" Gedge blinked. "I've never seen him on this floor." "Fascinating." Holmes straightened, brushing his coat sleeve. "I believe I have what I need, for now. But I must ask one more favour, Mr. Gedge." "Of course." "Tonight you are to do nothing, change nothing, bolt the door exactly as you have done, and then leave the rest to me." "To you?" Holmes smiled. "I shall remain here tonight." "But, Mr. Holmes, surely you don't mean to sleep here?" "Sleep is unlikely, Doctor," Holmes interjected, glancing my way. "Observation, on the other hand, shall be uninterrupted. I suspect that whoever visits this place does so not merely to intrude, but to confirm something, and I intend to let them believe they are unobserved." I could not help but shiver, despite the stale warmth of the flat. Holmes was already descending into that strange, trance-like intensity that overtook him when the scent of mystery sharpened. For the remainder of the cab ride home, he said almost nothing, save for one offhand remark. "The most dangerous locks," he said quietly, "are those that open to no one and nothing, yet still open." We arrived at Baker Street shortly after noon. Holmes immediately took to the chemistry table again, placing the paper fragment beneath his microscope and muttering fragments about graphite dust and institutional ink stocks. As for myself, I could not shake the image of the green door swinging open to no hand, a lock unbroken, a keyhole unscarred, yet some presence slipping silently past. And now Holmes would wait in that very room, like bait in a spring-loaded trap. And so we prepared for the night. By the time the lamps along the Thames embankment flickered to life, Holmes had packed a small black valise with what he referred to cryptically as minimal essentials for stationary espionage. A collapsible magnifier, a flask of something acrid, a length of dark cloth, and a small notebook found their place among more curious items I did not recognize at a glance. He insisted on making his way back to Lambeth alone, though I offered to accompany him. He refused with a brisk wave of the hand. "No, Watson," he said, already drawing on his gloves. "You, my dear fellow, are far too easily startled by creaking boards. If someone does appear tonight, I must be certain they believe the flat to be quite empty, or else only inhabited by Mr. Gedge, who will conveniently be staying with a friend in Hampstead, thanks to my suggestion." "And what if the intruder is dangerous?" "All the better," he said coolly, slipping his revolver into the inside pocket of his coat. "I should be most disappointed if he were not." He vanished into the fog like a silhouette melting into paper, leaving me to the uneasy companionship of the Baker Street hearth. I remained awake well past midnight, listening to the ticking of the mantel clock, glancing now and then at Holmes's empty chair, half expecting it to shift or speak. The next morning, at precisely 7 o'clock, Holmes returned, looking neither triumphant nor defeated, but deeply absorbed. He removed his coat and hat without a word, sat, and poured himself tea that had long gone cold. "Well?" I prompted. He gave a thin, distracted smile. "The lock opened itself again," he said. "You saw it happen?" "Indeed." I leaned forward. "And? Was it the caretaker, someone with a duplicate key?" Number what I saw was both more peculiar and, I dare say, more telling than any ordinary breaking and entering. "Allow me to reconstruct the scene for you." He stood and paced the floor, speaking as though to a lecture hall. I arrived at Gedge's flat shortly before 10. I bolted the door from the inside, double-checked the latches, and positioned myself in the wardrobe with a direct view of the entry. At approximately 1 hour past midnight, there came a faint disturbance, no sound, not quite movement either, but an atmospheric shift, as though someone had brushed the outside wall or displaced the air in the corridor. I raised an eyebrow. "Surely you're not suggesting ghosts?" Holmes looked at me sharply. "No, Watson. But I am suggesting something. Nearly as invisible, someone who understands silence as a tool, perhaps a professional of sorts." He resumed. "I watched. For nearly half an hour, nothing happened. But then quite suddenly the bolt shifted. Not forcefully, no resistance, no click of a turning key. It simply slid back. The latch slipped open, the door eased inward, perfectly smooth. There was no hand on the knob. Nothing in the visible spectrum moved." "That's impossible," I said, half rising. "Locks don't disengage on their own." Precisely why I chose the phrase, "the lock opened itself." Because that is how it appeared. By all logic, all physics, there was no intruder in sight. But the lock obeyed, as if summoned. He paused and gave me a piercing look. "Of course, locks don't truly open themselves. They require mechanisms, and mechanisms require manipulation." Then someone was there. Someone, Holmes said, was very much there. But not inside the flat, not at first. The door opened slightly, and that was when I moved. I crossed the room silently and stood in the darkness, out of sight. A full minute passed. Then a single gloved hand reached around the edge of the door and rested on the frame as if testing the air. My breath caught. Holmes continued. "It was a woman's hand, small, pale, gloved, in what looked to be thin grey wool. No ring, no scar, no adornment at all. After a few seconds, the hand withdrew. The door closed again. No footsteps, no sounds of descent, just absence." "What did you do?" "I followed, naturally." He sat down again, eyes glittering. "She had not descended the stairs, of that I am certain." I crept to the landing and looked down, empty. But above! He held up one finger. Above, I heard the faintest sigh. So faint, in fact, that had it not been for the stillness of the night, I might have missed it. I climbed the next flight, and at the top I found a narrow attic corridor. 4 doors, all shut, one with a nameplate. He reached into his coat and withdrew a torn scrap of card. "Miss Althea Venn, a reclusive artist, according to the landlady, who moved in some months ago and rarely receives visitors. I did not knock. I had no cause, yet. But I marked the place." I frowned. "Still, Holmes, if she has no key, how could she open the bolt from the outside?" "That, Watson, is the question around which this entire matter pivots. I intend to have my answer shortly. But first, I must verify something." He removed from his pocket the same triangular scrap of paper he had taken from Gedge's desk the day before. He laid it on the table beside the torn card. "Observe the fibres along the edges. Torn, not cut. Both scraps were once part of the same sheet." I bent closer. The tiers matched perfectly. A note then split in 2. One piece hidden, the other pocketed. Miss Venn had a reason to be inside that flat. Not to steal, not to threaten, to recover something. "And she got it?" "That I cannot say, but it may not have been the first time she tried." He stood once more and walked to the window, arms folded behind his back. "I have also confirmed," he said, "that Mr. Linley, the caretaker, is not quite as infirm as he pretends. He limps by day and leans heavily on a cane, but at night I observed him outside, smoking without assistance and moving with a surprising lightness. I believe he is in collusion with someone in the building. To what end? Holmes turned, the light of morning catching the sharp line of his features. That is what we shall find out, tonight. He took up his coat again, this time tossing it across the arm of the chair. I shall write to Miss Venn under a false name, requesting a sketching commission and asking her to bring samples to a neutral location. I want to observe her reactions, both to me and to the questions I shall pose. Watson, I may require your assistance in the meeting itself. I nodded. Gladly. Then prepare your kindest expression. You are to be an enthusiastic patron of the arts. And if she does not take the bait, she will. She is bold, but not immune to curiosity. The true criminal always believes themselves cleverer than the net. I could not help but smile. Holmes's mind was fully awake now, his restlessness sharpening into purpose. I had seen this look before, in the Devil's Foot affair, and in the shadow of the Bruce Partington plans. It was the look of a hunter closing in on the scent. Still, something about the quiet, unseen hand upon the door continued to trouble me. Not because it suggested violence, there had been none, but because it implied a presence with intent, not theft, not revenge, a recovery. Something in Gedge's flat did not belong to him. Something that was never meant to be found. By midday, Holmes had drafted the letter with a flourish of deliberate vagueness and just the right touch of upper-class whimsy. Written under the name of Mr. Adolphus Kinnear, a supposed gentleman with a growing interest in supporting the lesser-known talents of the London art scene, it invited Miss Althea Venn to bring a selection of her sketches to the tea-room at the British Museum the following afternoon. He included compliments on a fictitious piece titled Moonlight over Camden Lock, the name chosen, I presumed, for its suitably poetic ambiguity. "Do you think she'll come?" I asked, watching as he sealed the envelope and handed it off to a young boy with a sixpence and instructions for discreet delivery. "She will," Holmes replied calmly. "Curiosity is a more powerful lure than fear, especially to those who believe themselves the smarter hunter." He said little else for the remainder of the day. I busied myself with my medical notes while Holmes sat cross-legged in the armchair, fingers pressed together in silent meditation. Occasionally he murmured something about line of sight or mechanical transfer, but gave no clarification. The following afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, we took up positions in the British Museum's modest but respectable tea-room, tucked just off the Great Court. The day was clear, sunlight spilling through the tall windows onto the white tablecloths and glinting china. Holmes had transformed himself into the charming and slightly eccentric Mr. Kinnear, complete with a false moustache and spectacles, and a rich blue cravat knotted with theatrical flamboyance. I sat beside him, cast as his loyal but artless cousin from Surrey, who knew nothing of brush technique but adored anything with clouds. At 3:17 she arrived. Miss Althea Venn was younger than I expected, perhaps 25, no older than 30, with an angular face and tightly bound auburn hair. Her dress was simple but well tailored, and she carried a thin leather portfolio beneath one arm. She scanned the room once, spotted Holmes, and approached with a composure I could only admire. "Mr. Kinnear?" she asked, her voice low but clear. Holmes stood and bowed with exaggerated gallantry. "Indeed, and this is my cousin George, useless at art, but full of opinions." I inclined my head, mumbling a nervous greeting. She offered only the faintest of smiles as she took her seat. "You received my note, I see," Holmes continued, gesturing for tea to be brought. "I must say your work is even more intriguing in person than I'd been led to believe." "I'm not accustomed to being contacted by strangers," she said, her gaze steady. "Especially those who claim to have seen work I have never publicly exhibited." Holmes did not flinch. "Ah, but that's the thing about talent. It cannot remain hidden. Rumour, Miss Venn, is its inevitable herald." She said nothing for a moment, but the faintest twitch passed through her left eyebrow. Then she opened her portfolio and laid out 3 charcoal sketches. They were precise, evocative: streets at dusk, a half-seen face in a mirror, the edge of a garden gate half swallowed by shadow. Holmes studied them with exaggerated enthusiasm. Exquisite. Such restraint, such tension between presence and absence. What do you call this one? Number 4. He chuckled as if delighted. Ah, you artists and your mysteries. Tell me, Miss Venn, you live in Lambeth, do you not? A building just off Kennington Lane? I do, she said carefully. Have you been spying on me, Mr. Kinnear? Oh dear, only in the most flattering sense, I assure you. I know the area because I recently came into possession of a small flat there. I believe one of the tenants, Mr. Gedge, may be a neighbour of yours. She did not move, but her right hand slowly closed her portfolio. I've seen him on the stairs, she said quietly. Holmes leaned forward, lowering his voice. I ask because he tells the most peculiar story, Miss Venn, of a door that opens itself, of a presence at night, and, most strangely of all, of a page torn from a letter hidden in his own desk, half of which, I believe, you still possess. For the first time she blinked. I don't know what you're talking about. Holmes removed the fragment from his inner coat pocket and laid it gently on the tablecloth between them. She stared at it for a moment, just a breath too long, and then met his gaze. If that's yours, I suggest you be more careful with your papers. Holmes smiled softly but said nothing. I had the strange sensation that a game was being played between them which I could not see. 2 minds fencing with words where the real blades lay beneath the surface. The silence stretched, filled only by the gentle clink of teacups. Finally, she leaned back. I'll save us both time, Mr. Kinnear, if that is even your name. I did go to Mr. Gedge's flat, but not to steal, and certainly not to harm. I was retrieving something that should never have left my possession. The letter? Holmes asked. Number the sketch it wrapped. Sketch? She hesitated. It was a portrait, drawn years ago, of someone I lost. I sent it to someone I trusted. I didn't know it had fallen into other hands. When I learned it had, through a careless chain of events, I had no choice but to retrieve it quietly. Why not ask Mr. Gedge for it? Because he would have no idea what I was referring to. The man has never even opened half the drawers in that desk. The landlord left several items in the flat, abandoned from the previous tenant. Holmes nodded slowly. And the lock? He asked. You did not force it. How did you enter? Now she hesitated, truly hesitated, and her eyes flicked toward the door, as if calculating escape. But then, perhaps recognizing the futility of it, she answered. My father was a locksmith, she said. He taught me more than I ever wanted to know. I made an instrument, a small tension wrench and pick, thin enough to hide beneath a glove. The bolt on Gedge's door is old, precise, but easily manipulated once you understand the mechanism. It never made a sound. And the fragment we found in the drawer? She exhaled. A mistake. I tore the note without realizing something had stuck beneath it. Holmes sat back in his chair, folding his hands. I believe you, he said at last. I stared at him. You do? He nodded. Because it fits. The open door, the missing nothing, the silent intruder, it all points not to malice, but urgency. She did not break in to commit a crime. She broke in to correct one. Miss Venn looked down at the table, then back up. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter. I've been living quietly for some time, trying not to disturb the world more than necessary. But that portrait, I couldn't let it exist where it didn't belong. Holmes rose and offered her the envelope. Take it. I believe it has waited long enough. She accepted it with both hands. Then she stood, nodded once, and walked away. Holmes and I remained seated, the air now thick with a curious stillness. Well, I said after some time, you've solved the case. though I must say it was not what I expected. No murder, no theft, no villain to unmask, Holmes murmured. Only a secret, a grief, and a forgotten drawer. And yet, Watson, tell me honestly, was it not worth the pursuit? I nodded. Yes, but what now? Holmes gave me a thin, unreadable smile. Now we return to Baker Street. The rain is due again, and I've grown tired of mysteries that walk without leaving footprints. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street just as the clouds broke open once more, the city swallowed again in its familiar grey. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and damp stone, the scent of a London November that seemed always half awake. Holmes made no comment during our cab ride. He sat with his arms folded, his gaze distant, though his brow creased slightly as though caught on a problem whose edges had not yet come fully into view. I, for my part, felt that the case had resolved itself with unusual neatness. No violence, no villains, only a woman retrieving a piece of her past through unconventional means. And yet I knew Holmes well enough to sense that he was not entirely satisfied. There remained a sharpness in his silence, the way he tapped one finger rhythmically against the cane he had borrowed for his Mr. Kinnear persona. It was a pattern I recognized, not boredom, but doubt. It was not until we were seated again in our sitting room, fire crackling and tea steaming in the pot, that he spoke. "Watson," he said quietly, "does anything strike you as incomplete?" "I thought the matter was quite self-contained," I replied. "A curious burglary, a secret visitor, a recovered sketch, and no harm done." "No harm done," he repeated almost to himself. "And yet Miss Venn's story, true though it may be, rests on one assumption." "What's that?" "That the sketch she came to retrieve ever existed in the flat at all." I looked up from my cup. "But she recognized the fragment of the letter?" "She did, and I have no doubt it was once wrapped around something of value to her. But let us review the facts, Watson, precisely as they occurred." He rose and began to pace. Mr. Gedge reported 2 instances of the door found open, on mornings following nights when he was certain it had been locked and bolted. He heard no sound, observed no presence, and lost nothing of value. "When I spent the night there, I observed a hand, presumably Miss Venn's, reaching inside but taking nothing. She withdrew and vanished, leaving no trace behind. The only physical item linking her to the flat was a torn letter fragment in the desk drawer." "Which she admitted to leaving," I pointed out. "Just so, but why take the risk at all? Why return a second time if, as she claimed, the portrait had already been recovered during the first intrusion?" I paused, frowning. "Because she wasn't sure?" Holmes shook his head. "Miss Venn is not a careless woman. She is meticulous, skilled in silence, precise in her movements. Everything about her, her dress, her manner, her forged grace, suggests control. She would not have returned unless she believed the object of her search remained unfound." "But then—" He stopped pacing. "Watson, what if the item she sought was never hers to begin with?" I stared at him, unsure what he meant. "She told us a story, a touching one, a lost portrait, a memory, a grief. And perhaps that was true, but what if it was only mostly true? What if the item she sought was not merely sentimental, but dangerous?" The words hung in the air like frost on the window pane. "You suspect there's more?" "I suspect," Holmes said, "that Miss Venn is not alone in her interest in that flat. And I suspect our good Mr. Gedge may be more entangled than he realizes." He turned sharply and reached for his coat again. "Come," he said briskly. "There is someone we must speak to urgently." We arrived once more at the Lambeth residence, the steps now slick with rain, the hall lamps glowing dully behind their smudged glass. Mr. Gedge answered the door in his shirt-sleeves, clearly surprised to see us again so soon. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, has something happened?" "May we come in?" Holmes asked, already stepping past him. Gedge stood aside, flustered, as Holmes made for the sitting-room with purposeful speed. The silver watch still sat on the mantel, unmoved, The desk beneath the window looked as untouched as before. Holmes went directly to it, opened the same drawer, and examined the back corner. "Have you disturbed anything here since we last visited?" he asked sharply. "No," said Gedge, looking puzzled. "I haven't so much as written a note." "Why?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he opened the drawer beside it, the shallow one containing pens, nibs, and a few dried ink bottles. From beneath the tray at the bottom, he pulled out a folded sheet of yellowing paper. "What's this?" Gedge asked, stepping forward. Holmes unfolded it carefully, holding it up to the lamplight. The sheet bore a single diagram, a series of mechanical notations, handwritten and precise, detailing the inner workings of a locking mechanism I did not recognize. Along the top edge were the faint pencil marks of a name, mostly erased. Holmes read aloud, "Model 4M, rotary pin, dual-chamber lock, issued under contract to the Royal Armaments Testing Division." I blinked. "Is that military?" "Not just military," Holmes said. "Classified." Gedge paled. "But what is it doing here?" Holmes turned to him, his voice now clipped and cold. "That, Mr. Gedge, is the question we must answer. Tell."
"Me? Who lived in this flat before you?" "I don't know. The landlord said it had been vacant for nearly a year." "Not entirely true. I believe someone was here quite recently before your arrival. Someone who left in a hurry." Holmes turned the page over. On the back was an unfinished letter. "I cannot keep it much longer. If I disappear, it must be delivered to—" And there the sentence ended. "Watson," Holmes said without turning, "do you recall the smudge on the keyhole?" "Yes, you said it wasn't from Gedge's key." "Correct. Nor was it from Miss Venn's improvised tool. It bore traces of graphite, but also brass polish and a faint chemical compound, anti-rust lubricant used in military lock production." He turned to Gedge again. "Your flat, Mr. Gedge, was once occupied by someone working under contract to the government, likely a designer or tester of prototype locks. And I believe that person left behind more than just a drawing, something that Miss Venn or those she associates with desperately wanted to retrieve. But then, why wouldn't they just take it? Because they don't know exactly what it is, or where it is." Gedge swallowed. "So what happens now?" Holmes folded the document and placed it into his inner coat pocket. "Now, Mr. Gedge, you are going to pack a bag and stay with a friend outside the city, preferably one with no fixed address. Tonight. You think I'm in danger?" "I think someone believes this flat still holds a secret, and they may not knock politely a third time." As we left the flat, Holmes's expression remained unreadable. But I knew the signs, his shoulders tense, his pace clipped, his eyes scanning every window and shadow. The game, which had seemed finished, was beginning again, and this time it would not be played in silence. We left Lambeth under the cover of dusk, the gaslights casting long, uncertain shadows across the rain-darkened streets. Holmes did not speak until we were seated once again in the cab, and even then his words were measured, as though he were speaking more to the pieces of the puzzle in his mind than to me. "They were never looking for a portrait," he said. "That was a story spun with precision, a convincing one too, but too complete, too prepared." "And Miss Venn?" I asked. "You believe she's part of something larger?" "Miss Venn is not acting alone," he replied flatly. "She is skilled, yes, but even her abilities don't account for the deeper shadows around this case. Her second visit to the flat wasn't just out of concern that she'd left something behind. No, she returned because the object of her search was not where it was supposed to be. And that suggests someone else reached it first." "You think someone else was inside the flat before her?" "I'm certain of it," he said, tapping his cane once against the floor of the cab. "The caretaker, Mr. Linley,
Claimed to be little more than an idle servant of the building. Yet he moves without a limp when he thinks himself unobserved, and he has access to every flat. I suspect he's not the only one watching that place. But to what end? That, Holmes said quietly, is what I intend to find out. By the time we arrived back at Baker Street, a telegram had been slipped beneath the door. Holmes picked it up, read it once, and passed it silently to me. It was addressed from an inspector in Whitehall. Received request for list of civilian contractors tied to Lock Project 4 million. Name flagged Jonathan Pell. Project cancelled August 1892. Subject presumed deceased. Flat at Kennington Lane held under pseudonym until legal closure. No further data released. Clearance not confirmed. Holmes sat down, steepling his fingers before his face. Jonathan Pell, he said. I remember the name. He was a locksmith of formidable talent. Some even called him an artist, but he vanished 3 years ago under circumstances so vague, even the Times printed nothing more than a single-line notice. And his flat passed to Mr. Gedge? Eventually, likely after a respectable delay, and through a paper trail designed to obfuscate. But the real question is, who knew Pell had hidden something before his death, and who is only now realizing it? He stood suddenly, as if struck by a fresh current of thought. Come, Watson. I need your eyes. We're going to pay Mr. Linley a visit, and I want to catch him before the evening rounds give him a reason to disappear. Back in Lambeth, the fog had thickened, turning the stairwells into pale tunnels of light and shape. The caretaker's quarters were on the ground floor behind a warped wooden door that bore no nameplate. Holmes knocked twice, sharply. There was a pause, then the sound of someone shifting within. The door opened a crack. Linley appeared, stooped, white-haired, and draped in the tattered shawl of feigned fragility. "Evening," he croaked. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Holmes stepped forward with such abruptness that Linley flinched. "Mr. Linley," Holmes said, "a brief word. You'll forgive the intrusion, but it is in your interest." The old man hesitated, then stepped aside. His rooms were small, damp-smelling and bare, except for a locked cabinet in the corner and a kettle steaming faintly on the hob. Holmes ignored the pleasantries. "You were caretaker here during Mr. Pell's tenancy, were you not?" Linley said nothing. "And you know precisely what was left behind in that flat? In fact, I suspect you've been watching it ever since, waiting to see who would come for it." Linley's lips trembled, but not with fear, with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though it came out half-heartedly. Holmes's tone dropped to ice. "Mr. Linley, I have already confirmed through official channels that Mr. Pell's name is still under classified
review. Whatever he was involved in, it was not idle tinkering. And if you think to profit by selling what remains of his work—" "You think I'd sell it?" Linley snapped, surprising both of us. "That thing ruined his life. It got him killed." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "So it does still exist?" Linley sank into a worn chair and held his head in his hands. "It's not what you think," he muttered. "It's not a weapon or some infernal device. It's just a key." "A key?" I asked. "To what?" "To everything," Linley whispered. "To every lock. Pell called it the Unmaker, a universal skeleton made from memory metal, stuff that shifts just enough to fool tumblers. He spent years on it, said it could open any bolt designed by man." "And where is it now?" Holmes asked. Linley looked up, eyes bloodshot. "Gone. I kept it safe after he died. Buried it behind the boards in that flat behind the mantel. But someone else knew. Someone who started asking questions last week. Then Gedge gets the flat, and then her. Miss Venn. She came twice, didn't take anything the first time. The second, I don't know. I haven't dared go back." Holmes turned to me. We returned to the flat now. We climbed the stairs again, the air heavier with each step. The hallway was deserted, the doors still and silent. Holmes let himself in with the key Gedge had left behind. The flat looked untouched, but Holmes moved with new purpose. He went straight to the mantel, removed the clock, and ran his hand along the back panelling. His fingers tapped twice, then found a hollow tone. He pressed. The panel shifted open, revealing a narrow cavity. Empty. Holmes stared into it for a long moment. She has it, he murmured. She found it after all. And if it's what Linley claims, it will be valuable to many, he said. Too many. He straightened, his jaw set. She has not run yet. If she had, I'd have heard, which means she's still in London, and if she has what I think she has, she will try to sell it soon. To whom? To whoever offers the most. Criminals, spies, anarchists. The list is long. He turned to me, and for the first time in days, I saw a flash of real concern behind his calm. We must find her before they do. The night deepened as we made our way back through the fog-cloaked streets of Lambeth, Holmes walking ahead with a long, measured stride, his coat sweeping behind him like the trailing wing of some nocturnal bird of prey. I followed, half breathless, my mind spinning from Linley's revelations and the image of the hidden cavity behind Gedge's fireplace, now emptied. The unmaker, he had called it. A key, but more than a key. A tool designed to undo trust, to dissolve the very concept of security wherever it touched. We had seen strange inventions before, of course, deadly gases, encrypted ciphers, devices hidden in walking sticks. But this was
different. This was not merely an instrument of crime, it was a philosophical threat, a skeleton key for the world. And it now rested in the hands of a woman who knew how to vanish as easily as she appeared. Once inside Baker Street, Holmes discarded his coat with a practiced gesture, went directly to the fireplace, and stood before it with his fingers interlaced and pressed beneath his chin. "She'll move soon," he said at last. "She must. The unmaker is not something one keeps for sentimental reasons. She's either a courier, working for someone else, or she has already made contact with a buyer." "Then we go to Scotland Yard," I said, rising. "Alert the authorities. Set a watch on the ports, the train stations, the telegraph offices." "No," Holmes interrupted quietly. "Too soon. If we raise alarm before she acts, we drive her underground and then we lose her for good. No, Watson, we must watch, not chase." He crossed to his desk and retrieved a small, leather-bound ledger from the bottom drawer. "You recall the Diogenes affair?" he asked, flipping pages with swift efficiency. "Of course, the stolen embassy ledgers. Your brother played a rather significant role." "Indeed, and during that case we came into contact with a certain intermediary, a man who specialized in the purchase and sale of sensitive documents. He went by the name Drecker." "The antiquities dealer?" Holmes smiled. "Nominally, but in reality, Drecker is a broker of shadows. He traffics in whatever cannot be openly bought. If the unmaker is to be sold, it will pass through hands like his." He pulled a slip of paper from the ledger and penned a quick note. "We'll send word through one of his usual channels. A false inquiry about a rare mechanism. Nothing too direct. If he has heard whisper of the key, he'll respond." "And if he doesn't?" Holmes looked up, his gaze unreadable. "Then someone else already has it." He rang for a messenger and handed the note off with curt instructions. Then he turned back to me, his manner shifting with sudden energy. "Watson, gather your coat. We'll pay a visit to an old friend of ours, the proprietor of the Black Row Theatre." I stared. "You suspect her to be in hiding there?" "Not in hiding," Holmes said, already reaching for his scarf. "Performing." The Black Row Theatre was a faded jewel tucked between two warehouses near the river, a place for shadow plays, masked performances, and the occasional illegal fencing match held after hours. Holmes had once uncovered a smuggling ring beneath its floorboards, but he had kept the manager from prosecution in exchange for a steady flow of information. We arrived as the second act was beginning. The lobby was half lit, and the smell of cheap perfume mingled with the dampness of the nearby docks. Holmes slipped a coin to the girl at the ticket booth and guided me through a side entrance that led not to the audience, but to the backstage corridor. The theatre's owner, a wiry man named Harrow, emerged from the gloom with a raised brow and a mouthful of pinched sarcasm. "Mr. Holmes, you come when the rats stir or when the curtains fall. Which is it tonight?" "I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to be found," Holmes said, A woman, mid-20s, auburn hair, artist's hands. She may go by Ven, or she may not. Has she come through here in the last 2 days? Harrow narrowed his eyes. There's always girls drifting in and out. What's she done? Stolen a machine? Holmes said. One that opens all the wrong doors. Harrow considered. Then he jerked his chin toward the north stair. There's a woman fitting your description. Calls herself Clara. Came in yesterday asking after work. Said she'd done costume design in Paris. No references. She was gone this morning. Left behind a cup of tea. Barely touched. Where did she go? Didn't say, but she left something else too. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a folded scrap of thick, vellum-like paper. Holmes took it without a word. On one side was a quick charcoal sketch, the facade of a building, familiar yet incomplete. The angles were wrong, the lines softened. Holmes turned it sideways. Watson, he said slowly, this is the clock tower of King's Reach, drawn as if seen in reflection. From across the river? No, he said, his eyes narrowing. From beneath it? It took a moment before I understood. You believe she's gone underground? There are tunnels, service routes left over from the old sewer renovations, some forgotten entirely. She's hiding below the south bank. Then how do we find her? Holmes folded the paper again and placed it in his coat. We don't, not yet. She'll surface again, she must. The unmaker is useless in hiding. It is valuable only when it is seen, when it is feared. He turned to Harrow. If she returns, stall her. She may not come back, Harrow replied. Not if she senses your circling. Holmes smiled faintly. Then she will try to sell it soon, and when she does, she'll need to choose a buyer she trusts or believes she can deceive. We stepped back into the night, the fog now thick enough to shroud the street lamps in halos. She's clever, Holmes murmured, but cleverness will not protect her forever. Not with what she's holding. I pulled my coat tighter. And if someone buys it first? Then, he said quietly, we begin again. But the next doors that open may not be hers to choose. We walked in silence after that, the city sprawling around us, each window shuttered against the darkness, each alleyway a possible answer waiting in the mist. The following day dawned pale and raw, the kind of London morning that crept in through cracks in the window panes and left the fire struggling to hold back the damp. I found Holmes already awake and seated at the desk, his breakfast untouched, the previous night's sketch from the theatre unfolded before him. A blank sheet lay beside it, now half filled with Holmes's own hand-drawn map, thin, jagged lines tracing hidden routes beneath the south bank. Without looking up, he said, the tunnels were originally mapped in 1849 for the first wave of sewer renovations. Pell would have known about them. His contracts with the Ministry of Works included water main vaults and underground storage vaults. If Venn inherited anything from him, blueprints, access codes, a familiarity with London's underbelly, then she wouldn't just hide there, she'd use it. I sat down across from him and took a sip of lukewarm tea. Use it how? As leverage, he said. To trade the unmaker, she must meet with someone. Someone who understands its worth but cannot claim it publicly. That kind of buyer prefers privacy, the sort only a buried chamber can offer. There came a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, carrying a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it with one fluid motion, scanned its contents and handed it silently to me. From Drecker, client interest confirmed. Item referred to as lock tongue. Offer made, 2,000 guineas. Exchange requested within 48 hours. Location withheld. Further message expected. Holmes rose without a word and walked to the window, the grey light framing him like the edge of a photograph. She's moving quickly now, he said, using aliases, testing her value. She's reached out through Drecker, likely under a different name, but she's chosen a high enough price to attract only those with the resources and discretion to meet it. And the meeting place? She'll name it when she feels safe. But she will not meet them in a bank or drawing room. Number, She'll pick a space she controls, isolated, silent, invisible from the surface, a vault beneath the city. I frowned. And you can find it? Holmes turned back to the table and pointed to the lower corner of the map he'd begun. Here, one of the last unused maintenance subvaults, abandoned since the collapse of the Bermondsey Wing in '87. Access is restricted, no street-level entrance, but reachable through an old drainage hatch in Shadwell Basin. You're certain? I'm not certain of anything, he said grimly. But if I had a device that could render the very concept of private property meaningless, and I wished to sell it without ever stepping into the light, I would sell it there. He rolled up the map and slipped it into his coat. Come, Watson, we must go before the deal is struck. It was nearly noon when we arrived at the rusted gate beside Shadwell Basin, the tide low, the river slick and sullen behind the warehouse stacks. Holmes led us through a narrow alley between two loading yards, the walls dripping with condensation, the air thick, with the scent of oil and iron. Behind a stack of discarded lumber, we found the hatch. Holmes knelt and brushed aside the debris. The cover was bolted with age, but not locked. With effort, we pried it open and descended into darkness. The tunnel was narrower than I expected, no more than 5 feet in width, and barely tall enough to stand. Our lantern cast a pale circle ahead of us, revealing brick walls slick with moisture and the scurry of unseen rodents. We moved in silence, boots echoing against stone and metal. At one point we passed a crumbling side corridor, half collapsed, but Holmes ignored it. He continued forward with unwavering certainty until the passage opened into a wider chamber, round, with arched ceilings and stone columns rising like ribs from the floor. And there, on the far side, stood Miss Venn. She was alone, or appeared to be. Her cloak was heavy and dark, her hair tucked into the collar. In her hands, she held a small leather case. She was facing another figure, a tall man in a grey coat, the kind worn by shipping agents or foreign dignitaries trying not to look like either. His face was obscured by the lantern between them, but his posture was unmistakable, rigid, formal, and alert. Holmes touched my arm and motioned for silence. We stayed in the shadows just beyond the archway. You understand what this is? She asked, her voice carrying easily in the vaulted chamber. The man nodded. The price has been accepted. Payment is waiting. Good, she said. Then I'll show you. She opened the case. Even from our distance I could see the gleam of polished metal inside, a slim rod, jointed with strange notches along its spine. The man leaned forward to examine it. It folds, she said, and adapts. One end for modern locks, the other for older makes. I've tested it on 8 different models. No failure. No trace left behind. Who built it? The man asked. She hesitated. No one you could ever question. The man nodded, then reached into his coat. At that moment, Holmes stepped forward. That will be quite enough, he said clearly, his voice ringing through the chamber like a bell. Miss Venn froze. The man half-turned, his hand dropping, but not empty. Holmes raised one finger, slowly. Put it away, he said. The man considered, then pocketed the weapon. Holmes walked forward calmly like a professor approaching a chalkboard. You've both shown admirable discretion, he said. But I'm afraid I must interrupt. Miss Venn, I believe we've delayed the inevitable long enough. That item must not leave this city. She turned, her face unreadable. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Holmes. No, he said softly. But you're playing a game whose stakes you do not fully comprehend. She glanced toward the man in grey. He's already paid. Holmes gave a faint smile. Then he'll be refunded. I need this, she said. I need what it buys. And I don't doubt that, but there are others who will want it for what it destroys, and they will not be as polite as he is. She looked at him for a long time, then back at the case in her hands. I didn't mean for any of this, she murmured. No, Holmes replied, but intent is rarely the engine of consequence. There was a silence. Then, slowly, She closed the case and handed it to him. He took it gently, as if receiving a crown. The man in grey turned and disappeared into the shadows without a word. Holmes exhaled once, and I saw a flicker of relief cross his face. "We'll return this to Whitehall," he said. "Let them decide what's to be done with it. Though I rather imagine it will vanish into some vault and never be spoken of again." Miss Venn nodded. "What will happen to me?" "That depends," he said. "Were you working alone?" "Yes." Holmes studied her a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Then go. Leave London. Don't come back. And don't let anyone know you were ever part of this." She looked at him, startled. But she took the offer. And the next moment, she was gone into the tunnels. Holmes turned to me, the unmaker still in his hand. "Come, Watson, let's get this back into the dark where it belongs." And as we left the chamber behind, I couldn't help but glance back, once at the empty space where something almost undetectable had just changed the balance of the world. The journey back to Baker Street was made in silence, save for the occasional rattle of the hansom wheels and the distant hiss of rain on stone. Holmes held the small case in his lap with a curious gentleness, as though it contained not just a tool of precision engineering, but something far more delicate, an idea too dangerous to let slip into the world unguarded. His eyes, fixed on the blurred streets beyond the cab window, were distant and unreadable, and I knew better than to interrupt him while he walked the final steps of the puzzle in his mind. By the time we reached the warmth of our sitting room, the fog had thickened, blanketing the city in a smothering quiet. Holmes placed the case on the mantel, beside the Persian slipper that held his tobacco, and stood for a long moment, gazing into the fire. The flickering light caught the brass inlays of the unmaker, even through its case, casting odd glints along the wall. It looked so slight, so unremarkable, yet it had almost sold for a small fortune, and might have unfastened the locks of empires. He finally spoke. "She's gone, truly gone, I believe. Miss Venn will not return to London, not while there's breath in her." I settled into my chair. "Do you think she understood what she was holding?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Enough to fear it. Not enough to predict how many would kill for it." I nodded slowly. "And the buyer?" "He will not report this failure. His presence in London was already outside legal channels."
Recognize the cut of his coat and the accent. He's Prussian, likely connected to one of the newer intelligence branches. If he's wise, he'll disappear just as Miss Venn has. "And the unmaker?" I asked, gesturing to the case. Holmes gave no answer at first. He walked over to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and retrieved a length of wax-sealed string and a folded sheet of government paper. He set them beside the case with mechanical care. "I shall write to Mycroft," he said. "He'll know how to arrange for secure collection. The fewer people who know of this artifact's recovery, the safer London remains. It will be classified under a name no one recognizes, catalogued in a ledger no clerk will be permitted to read." He began writing at once, his pen scratching steadily against the page. I sat quietly, allowing him his rhythm, listening only to the slow tick of the clock and the occasional rattle of coal in the grate. When he finished, he bound the note, wrapped the case in its oilskin, and sealed the whole parcel with a deep red wax, pressing into it the signet ring I had seen only once before during the scandal surrounding the Bruce Partington plans. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and unhurried. "Watson, do you recall what Pell wrote at the end of his final note?" I nodded. "If I disappear, it must be delivered to—" And then the line ends. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together once more. I believe Pell knew he would be erased, vanished not only from his home, but from public record. He designed the unmaker as a tool for the state, and when he realized what it could truly do, he tried to reclaim it, perhaps to destroy it. But someone higher up ensured his silence. They left just enough of him behind to vanish without trace. "You think Miss Venn knew this?" "I think she suspected," Holmes replied. She never said it aloud, but I believe the so-called portrait she claimed to be recovering, that detail she gave us in the cafe, was a metaphor, a code, perhaps, or a misdirection, born of half-knowledge. She may have believed the sketch concealed something literal. In truth, what she found was the sketch was the object, a blueprint of something meant never to be used. I stared into the fire, unsure what disturbed me more, that such a tool had been created, or that it had been nearly sold in one of London's deepest shadows. Holmes rose once again and crossed to the bookshelf, where he pulled down a battered copy of Pliny's Natural History and turned to a page whose margins were filled with his own annotations. He stared at it without reading. "There are objects," he said, "whose danger lies not in their application, but in their very existence. The unmaker is such a thing, were it myth, no harm. But now the myth has bones, shape, a weight that tempts hands we would never see coming." I felt a chill, despite the fire. "And yet he,"
continued, "it was not stolen, it was given, passed between hands by those who believed themselves righteous, desperate, or clever. That is the lesson." He closed the book and looked at me with quiet intensity. When man designs the key to every door, he must be prepared to watch every door open, even the ones he never built. I said nothing for a while. The weight of the case still lingered in the room, even after Holmes had sealed it, even after the messenger from Mycroft's office arrived to carry it away into the bowels of Whitehall. When the door finally closed behind the courier, Holmes returned to the window and stood silently, his silhouette sharp against the lanterns outside. "Is it over?" I asked. "No," he said, "but it is paused. And sometimes, Watson, that is the best we can do." That night I wrote no notes in my journal. I made no effort to summarize the case for publication. There are some accounts not meant for print, some shadows that must remain shadows, and in that quiet pause, in the stillness that followed, I understood why Holmes had pursued this case with such intensity. It was not curiosity alone, not merely the thrill of pursuit. It was fear, cold, clear, rational fear, not of a criminal, but of a possibility. And that, more than any villain, was the thing he most despised. The next morning, the world outside Baker Street had returned to its familiar rhythm. Carriages clattered down wet cobblestones, milk carts clinked with bottles in the alleyways, and a newsboy called the headlines with a voice that cracked from cold. Within the sitting room, however, a peculiar quiet had settled, a quiet not of peace, but of aftermath. Holmes had taken to his armchair without word or motion, his violin untouched in the corner, his breakfast tray left precisely as Mrs. Hudson had delivered it. I observed him from across the room, notebook closed on my lap. Though the case had concluded, or so it would appear to anyone reading the surface of events, I sensed Holmes was still listening for something, as though the final chord had yet to strike. His posture, too still, belied a mind still threading the remnants of a mystery whose ripples had not yet stilled. "Holmes," I said gently, "you've not spoken since the courier left." "If the unmaker is safely in Whitehall's hands—" "Is it?" he said suddenly, eyes still fixed on the fire. I blinked. "You mean to say you doubt the courier?" "No," he said, "not the boy. Not Mycroft's men either. I trust them to bury it as ordered. But trust, Watson, is a currency even the most cautious man must spend eventually. And we rarely know if we've paid too much until the debt returns." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and stood for a long moment where the case had rested only hours earlier. Then, slowly, he turned. "Something has been troubling me since the tunnels. Something so subtle I missed it, until now." I sat forward. "The man in grey," Holmes said, his silence, his stillness. He never once asked how the device worked, never even asked for a demonstration, and yet he was prepared to pay a fortune. "Perhaps he already knew," I offered. Holmes nodded. "Precisely, but how? Miss Venn had only just secured the unmaker. She had not announced its existence openly, only whispered through Drecker's circles. For the man to arrive so quickly, so prepared, suggests advanced knowledge, knowledge not of the seller but of the object. He began pacing. The man wasn't buying a marvel, he was reclaiming something lost. And if that's true, he trailed off. You think he was connected to Pell? I asked. Not Pell, Holmes replied. Someone above him. Perhaps someone within the very agency that commissioned the Unmaker in the first place. Pell created something too powerful, too indiscriminate. He tried to hide it, perhaps even to destroy it. But what if the project didn't end when he vanished? What if it divided? He stopped at the window, watching the fog roll across Baker Street. We assumed the Unmaker was unique, but what if it wasn't? My throat went dry. You believe there are more? Holmes did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was almost distant. Pell was not the only mind in London capable of such invention. If his work was ever copied, even partially, then the blueprint exists elsewhere. Perhaps scattered, perhaps waiting. He turned suddenly and reached for the folder Mycroft's courier had left days ago, one marked with the seal of the Crown and the scrawled notation property. Restricted lock trials, cancelled 1892. He flipped through its pages with sharp, practiced fingers until he found the one he'd been seeking. There, in faded ink, was a technical drawing remarkably similar to what we had seen in the vault beneath Lambeth. But in the margin, faint and easily overlooked, was a notation in a different hand. C revision, Batch C, alternate mechanism for adaptive shafting. Batch C, Holmes said. There were at least 3 prototypes, and we've only recovered 1. The implications struck me like a sudden chill. Then it isn't over. Holmes met my gaze, and in his expression I saw not fear, but grim resolve. No, Watson, it has only changed shape. He rolled up the folder and secured it in twine. We must notify Mycroft again, and quietly. This cannot become public. There would be a panic. And Miss Venn? I asked. She may know more than she told us. She may, Holmes agreed, but she is beyond our reach for now. She's done what she believed was right, and I do not intend to summon her back to answer for surviving a danger others allowed to exist. He looked down at the twine in his hands, then slowly let it drop onto the desk. But someone else will come. If Batch C still exists, someone will come for it. And they will not arrive with coin or courtesy. There was a silence between us. Then I stood and crossed to the window, watching as the fog thinned for a moment and let the pale sun pass through the branches outside. In that faint light, it was almost possible to believe the world unthreatened again. But the memory of the vault, the cold curve of that impossible key, and the grey-coated man's stillness returned, unbidden. What will we do when they come? I asked softly. Holmes did not hesitate. We'll watch, we'll listen, and when they do, we'll be ready. He sat down again, finally reaching for his violin. He lifted it, tested the strings with his thumb, then drew the bow gently across its surface. A low, resonant chord filled the air, not mournful, not joyful, but poised on the edge between. As the notes drifted through the flat, I opened my journal and wrote the first line of a case I would never publish. The lock opened by itself, but the world will never be the same again. A week had passed since the final trace of the Unmaker left Baker Street in the hands of Mycroft's courier. During that time, Holmes returned to his ordinary habits with outward ease, perusing monographs on the nervous system of Lepidoptera, composing violin etudes of dizzying complexity, and even challenging me to 2 consecutive games of chess, which he won without lifting his eyes from the board. But beneath the surface I could sense the ripple that remained, a vibration in the thread of the world that only he could hear. One afternoon, as a pale sun reached over the rooftops, Holmes received a slim envelope bearing no seal. He studied it carefully, breaking it open with the flat of his knife. I watched as his eyes scanned the page, once, twice, then narrowed ever so slightly. It's from Mycroft, he said, folding the paper and slipping it into the fire. And Holmes sat back. Batch C was real. The copy of the Unmaker had indeed been made and then dismantled, or so they believe. The man responsible, a second engineer working under Pell named Levington, died in an explosion 6 months after Pell's disappearance. His notes were deemed incomplete. Mycroft's people believe the remaining components were destroyed with him. "You sound unconvinced," I said. "I am never wholly convinced by what a government is certain it has buried," Holmes replied. "But for now, I will allow the matter to rest." I nodded slowly, though the weight of the case remained. There were still pieces of the mystery I had not fully made peace with. I voiced one of them now. "Miss Venn, do you think she told us everything?" "No," Holmes said at once, and with no trace of bitterness. "But she told us what she could bear to say. Her father's disappearance, her quiet life on the margins, her attempt to right a wrong that may not have been hers to begin with. It all reads like a shadow version of a tragedy we'll never see clearly." He stood and moved to the window where the streets bustled below, unaware of the fire that had nearly slipped between their cracks. "She was no thief," he said, watching a brougham turn the corner. "But neither was she innocent. She inherited danger in the form of memory, sketches, whispered instructions, hints from a man too wise to trust the world with what he built. She acted with the desperation of someone trying to prevent a second erasure." "And did she succeed?" I asked. Holmes was quiet for a time. "Yes," he said finally, "because the Unmaker will not fall into the hands of those who would exploit it. That alone is victory enough. But whether she found peace, that is a question only time may answer." There was a knock at the door, Mrs. Hudson bringing in a parcel from the British Museum. Holmes opened it with a flick of his wrist. Inside was a leather-bound book, thin and worn, titled "Locks and Their Historical Variants" by Jonathan Pell. A note accompanied it, found misfiled in the museum's secondary collection, believed to be the only surviving volume with the author's marginalia. Holmes turned the pages slowly until he found what he was looking for. On the inside back cover, a handwritten scrawl in faded ink. "The perfect lock is not the one that opens only to the right key. It is the one no one dares try." He closed the book and set it gently aside. We said little more that day. The fog returned and the city resumed its hush. Outside, men argued in the street and carriages passed as they always did. But we both knew something invisible had been restored to silence, narrowly, like a door left ajar and then quietly closed before anyone noticed the wind. It was not Holmes' most celebrated case. There were no headlines, no arrests, no courtroom drama. But for those brief days in November, he had played a silent game with shadows, and won. That night, before I extinguished the lamp, I asked one final question. "Do you think there will ever come a time when such things, devices like the Unmaker, can be trusted?" Holmes gave a weary smile. "Perhaps, but only when men no longer desire to open what was never meant to be unlocked." And with that, he turned back to his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a soft, meditative note that faded slowly into the firelit dark, just as the memory of the lock that opened by itself would, in time, fade from every place but one.